Manager, and it's my pleasure to introduce the artist Katya Roberts. Katya Roberts was born in Kyiv, Ukraine, and grew up in California. She has a BS in sociology with an art emphasis from UCLA. In 2002, she received the UCLA Women in Art Award. After working at Fox Studios, she taught and developed the visual art curriculum at Pacifica, a college preparatory school in Santa Monica, California. Upon moving to Rochester, Minnesota in 2016, Katya founded the Mayo Art Group. In 2017, she was awarded for her sculptural proposal for the public art series, Art for Trails. Unbroken is an aluminum sculpture now in permanent installation at Mayo Park in Rochester. Additionally, she was a recipient of the Southeastern Minnesota Arts Council grant for a solo exhibition titled Traverse at the Rochester Art Center. Her recent exhibition, This Side of the Sun, at the Turret Gallery in the historic Castle Building in Rochester, was an exploration of time and place. Thematically centered on Herfjall, the great volcanic crater in Iceland, the audience was offered immersive contemplative and sensory experience, which prompted questions about chance and faith. Katya and her family have lived in New Hampshire since 2020. Please welcome the artist, Katya Roberts.
Thank you, Sam. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to this beautiful art center and everybody who makes this, helps this place run smoothly, like Sam, Travis, and the director of the art center, of course, as well. And thank you to my family for continued support in all of my artistic adventures and for helping me make things happen in the ways that they inspire the work that they might not even realize. So I appreciate this gorgeous space. I remember walking in here for the first time about 1.5 years ago, as we were new to the area from Minnesota and just wanting to get a sense of the space and see the artwork that was on view and get a sense of the community here as well. I met Sam at the time, and it felt very much like my work could certainly live here well, and I began to think about what the work was that I was already sort of beginning to do back at home and back in the studio. But I was continuously keeping the space in mind where the work would ultimately live. Whether I'm creating something three-dimensional, like an installation, or a sculpture, or two-dimensional charcoal drawing, I do very much consider the space and how it's ultimately going to live, is what I call it. You know, you spend all this time very intimately in your studio with the work, and it's kind of a often solitary pursuit, but then you think about how it's going to go and have a life apart from you, and I think that doesn't really happen until the work gets to be shown publicly, and I consider that a part of the cycle, part of the creative cycle, that it doesn't just stay insular, that it has the freedom to take on a life of its own and speak for itself, and people can speak into it and speak into their read on the work or kind of extend some truths about it, and I find that really exciting. It's probably the reason why I continue to create. I mean, there's various reasons, but that certainly fuels me because there's a little bit of magic that happens when you allow the work to sort of, you don't hold it in tight grip in your hands, but you hold it in kind of an open hand, and you get to see what it ends up doing. That's always exciting for me. So this exhibition in particular, Reclamation Through the Woods, is largely about living through unknowns and also about community. And I'll get into some examples and talk about past work and how some of the themes that began to thread through the tapestry of the past work, how they also come out as threads in the body of work that you guys see here today. So I'm going to reference some of the past work with the intent of having, of sharing some of those big overarching themes, and it'll be interesting for me to not necessarily sort of spell everything out, but to leave it for you guys to make some of those connections as well as you see the work and kind of it's your opportunity to play into its life. So as I mentioned, not only do I consider the space, but I consider the different pieces that I create, whether two-dimensional or three-dimensional, to be in conversation with each other. So they may be extending a truth about each other. So one piece might be saying one thing, if you think about, like art as a conversation in the big scheme of things, like over the years, over the centuries. But also, I sort of think through about my various bodies of work that way too, where past bodies of work, as well as within a particular exhibition, each piece might be kind of adding a sentence in a paragraph to what the whole picture is, or what I'm trying to say with the whole exhibition. So they inform each other, and one of the themes that threads through all of the work, I sort of find inescapable, even if I'm not trying to explore this theme, just comes out, is our relationship to time. And that will come up a couple of times in this presentation. Just bear with me. The mouse is not, let's see, it's escaping. Oh, here we go. I think I got it. Yes, got it. Thank you. You just needed your magic, walking over here, and that did the trick. Some of the past things that my work has looked at is community, which I mentioned is certainly the case in this exhibition, as well as communication. Sometimes it's the ways that we communicate, or sometimes it's sort of a question of what is nature trying to say to us. If nature could speak, what would it say? Or if it could sing, what is that song? And additionally, because I'm very much inspired by geologically active landscapes, time plays into geologically active landscapes as well, and I sort of like to juxtapose human history, or think about our sense of time as humans within human history, and within kind of the world that we're living in, within the Earth, and considering geological history. So the two kind of become threads that are happening at the same time, and I think that's another way that I look at human history through geological history, or through our relationship to the natural world and to geologically active landscapes, and I'll show some examples of that. As Sam mentioned, I come from a background in sociology, so just from the very start, my brain always thought about the way that people in spaces influence each other, and that's important for me in the way that I work as well. I enjoy creating in large scale, because there's a relationship of kind of my body to the work. If I can sort of stand next to it, or I can touch it or move it in such a way that I'm aware of my body in relationship to it. And I think perhaps later when you guys walk around and look at some of the drawings, you might become aware of sort of the way you're moving in relationship to the drawing, or relationship to the floor element that I might have left on the floor, and how it sort of changes the way that you experience space, or the way that you might move about the space. I think about the viewer coming into a sort of dance almost when coming into an exhibition space, where I hope that you're invited to sort of look across, like look up, squat down, I tried to create sort of large moments, kind of macro moments, as well as micro moments that sort of bring you in, where you could maybe look at texture on something, or feel the weight of something, and creating kind of a more intimate moment within the larger installations, or within the larger exhibition. And I think all of that, I'm still sort of tying it back to my sociology background again, is that sort of awareness of people and spaces and how we influence each other. So that being said, I do think about, as I think about the viewer's experience, it's important for me to create work that is immersive, that really kind of not only invites you in, but you're sort of already there, and just, I think Sam and Travis did a walkthrough of the exhibition last Friday, and I appreciated Travis just saying that he felt like there was kind of a world and you're already in it. I took that as a big compliment. I was like, oh, great, it worked. So this sort of immersive quality is something that I intentionally pursue with the work, but not necessarily as something I've intellectually decided on. I just think it's just kind of as a natural proclivity in the way that I work. So while I'm really drawn to material and I like to touch and have these kind of tactile moments, I keep looking at the volcanic rock here. Even as I look, I see it in my view, I want to pick it up and feel it. It's actually quite lightweight, but very porous. That's interesting to me. And charcoal, the hours of working on the surface with charcoal, the way that it falls, in small powdery form, or the way that sometimes the whole charcoal will accidentally leave my hand and plunk on the ground. Just this kind of materiality, it kind of excites me, I think, in a way, to keep creating with the various materials. But at the same time, I try to push the materials into some sort of meditative state. And I think a part of it is the way that I create. I do sort of take on meditative type of actions during the creation process. And I think perhaps in the end, that sort of yields to something where I hopefully have pushed the material into creating something with it that invites the viewer to slow down and maybe just experience time a little bit differently, kind of in the perspective of kind of meditation being something that slows you down and helps you to be aware in the here and now, within your own body in relationship to other living things and objects in the world. Okay, I think it's time to go to the next slide. So I will share a lot of photographs from past work because you see the work on view here, but I do have a few that I wanted to discuss this one right behind me. This particular piece is called Outside Within, and the visual inspiration for this piece, something that came to me during our walks as a family through a couple of different places. So I'm going to talk about Yellowstone National Park and the Black Sand Basin there. That's one of the locations that has informed the work here. And then just the forests of New Hampshire right outside of my studio. And this particular stump is kind of a combination of two. I will show you later the one that I saw at Yellowstone National Park. And this one, well, the second thing that is combined with visually is a stump that we just happened to see on our walk as a family. And I was drawn into it because it just struck me that it created this hollow space that was essentially a dead tree. It was in a state of decay, but that it served a purpose for animals. It was a place of shelter. It was a place of survival. I could find, and I began to pay attention to these hollowed out tree trunks and stumps and stuff, and I would go up to them and kind of inspect them, and often I would find evidence of little acorns or little shells, or I don't know even what, discarded little pieces just outside. And so I think about, somebody had a dinner party here yesterday, and this is the way that they're using the space. And I think about, they felt safe here, and they felt protected here. And so this kind of idea of shelter, otherwise in an unknown environment, or this idea of kind of going within while being outside. So it's outside within. And I started to think about why we take walks and why we go on little hikes through the forests of New Hampshire. And it was striking me that, I'll say this for myself, but I think other people perhaps experience this as well, that we go out there to discover things, to experience things, but really what we're looking for is to like illuminate something within, or we find something about ourselves. So this kind of theme of going out to fill our understanding of what's within better is kind of one of the themes that doesn't only apply to this particular charcoal drawing, but to other pieces in the show as well, and perhaps just the show overall, even with the title Reclamation, through the woods, pointing to the fact that there's sort of an experience and something to be gained with this going through. So the next piece I'll talk about is Horizon. And Horizon starts as a charcoal drawing of a branch, very long branch. I find it very elegant and beautiful. And I placed it in a horizontal orientation, and then off of that branch takes off a piece of thread. And that thread actually tracks around the entire gallery and ends sort of where my gallery space concludes, and it finishes by turning into plaster form. So it goes from sort of this drawing representation of a horizon through a branch to this thread. There's a few changes in color that I play with as well, and then it sort of materializes. And I just thought, just to kind of to have being drawn to the material, having a horizon materialize was kind of like interesting to me. And the reason I went in this direction is because I was inspired by Anne Hamilton's words. So I've been fortunate enough to have some dinners with Anne Hamilton where we just sit and talk about art and the art process. And she told me that what's often the case is really what is the question, So in a body of work or in an exhibition or an installation art piece, she says the question is, what is the question? So when just thinking about the work coming into Ava Gallery here, the question for me was sort of like, okay, well, I've got all these branches and all these trees. I'm going to do this house. And it's coming into a building, right? It's coming into a building with walls. So for me, the question became, what if the walls are not walls? Well, if the walls are not walls, then I think it needs a horizon. So the horizon line happened as a result of that thought. So the horizon becomes tangible, and once you've got a horizon, I think you've got a journey, right? So I realized in the last maybe 2 or 3 exhibitions that while I'm doing, different types of, I'm inspired by different types of landscapes, I focus on different kinds of themes, but all in all, I realized that I'm offering the viewer a journey, or I'm inviting them to come along and have a sort of like meandering, in this case, I would say, experience. So as an invitation to meander in placing the work where it lives, that was definitely a consideration of how to move through the space in a way that kind of maximizes that like slowing of the step and being able to kind of meander around. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are the tree, I call them trees, even though they're branches that we picked up in the forest, or I picked up in the forest and painted. But then once I brought them into my studio space, I began initially just by leaning them on the wall and painting them and playing with them, not really knowing, at first why I'm doing this, but just sometimes you just go with it, and then you find out like the why later. Sometimes you wait for the work to tell you what it's, forming itself to be. So that's how it began with the branches, but I had something in my mind when I was picking them up and painting them, especially the colors that I chose to paint them, and that is specifically the trees that I saw at the Black Sand Basin. Let's see. So to kind of understand why those trees came into play with the trees in New Hampshire, I'm going to talk about this idea of monuments in nature. So I'll reference some of my past work to point to that further. One thing I just wanted to mention, another artist who influences my work is Eamon O'Kane. And Eamon O'Kane says that we are not separate from nature. We tend to think that there it is, we look at it, and here we are, and we do our thing. He says we are nature. And that's something that resonates with me when I think about the fractal designs within our own biology, like the veins, for example, and I think about the fractal designs in the natural world, like in branches or rivers, for example. It just kind of reminds me and echoes our connection to the natural world and the way that we're made, just as those entities are made that way as well. So we are nature. So the idea of monuments in nature is something that's developed over my last couple of bodies of work, and it's related to the trees here, and that's why I'll go into that a little bit. This is just an example of something that looks very monument-like in Iceland, and this is a lava field, and just the way that the lava acted and the way that water mixed with the lava, they ended up coming up into these formations, almost like they look like they rose up out of the ground. Here's an example of a past painting / installation called Path. And Path was informed and inspired by landscapes in Iceland that are, there's a sense of danger to the landscapes in Iceland sometimes, but it's a vast kind of beauty and a very kind of high contrast sort of beauty with the dark darks and the light colors as well, and beautiful blues. So this is Path. And I'm just going to discuss the previous exhibition that I had because it's going to, again, illuminate this idea of monuments in nature. So this side of the sun was an exhibition that went up in 2020 in Rochester, Minnesota. It opened in March, and then in February, the world closed down. Luckily, I was able to have an opening night and an artist talk, and I think just about a week after the artist talk or something, we experienced the worldwide shutdown because of the COVID pandemic. So then the work remained on view without viewers for the next 6 months, no, not 6, maybe 5 months. And when we were actually moving to New Hampshire in July, I called up the gallery owner and I said, we gotta go, I need to come take the work. And this was an interesting experience, especially for work that kind of deals with time already, to suddenly have experienced time in a different way, as I'm sure different people have had a different response to the way that we experienced time during that time, but I feel like everybody's felt it on some level. And just to give you an idea from the outside, the castle, it's called the castle building, and it has this turret, and one of the works that I'll be pointing out later, it goes up into the turrets. I wanted you to see it from the outside. And here's some kids interacting with the volcanic rock, and actually some of the volcanic rock in here is from that, and some of the volcanic rock in this reclamation house is from the water house, which I'll talk about shortly. So after that exhibition closed and we moved, I had an opportunity to show the work at the church that we attend again, and it was kind of an opportunity to turn the lights back on this exhibition that went dark at a time of living through unknowns. Well, it started out that way, and then suddenly the invasion in Ukraine began, and we began living through another unknown, especially for me being Ukrainian American. I decided to go ahead with the show and still show it, and even though it was a really difficult time to proceed to do anything creative at first, but we were able to have an evening for Ukraine and raise funds for the refugees. And as a result of that, I created some of the new works for that show that have to do with just thinking about Ukraine. The piece on the left is called To Bloom Bright Yellow Again. And the piece on the right is called In the Fields. This next piece was also added. They had a place to hang coats, and I just really wanted to use that space, and had this idea to create a coat. This was sewn out of songbook pages, and it's gold leafed on the inside, and it's a replica of my father's coat. And my father's from Siberia. My mother's half Polish, half Ukrainian, and I was born in Ukraine. So at the time, this felt very much like I was wrestling with sort of reconciling the irreconcilable. So just something I was thinking about while I was sewing it, but I was also thinking about how sewing is kind of a meditative act, and it's kind of an act of care. And often mending or sewing is an act that goes unnoticed or unseen, and it's often the women that perform the act. So this went into the work as well as me kind of thinking about the way that I want to help care for the country and help care for a devastating situation, and just try to sort of mend and see, what can be done. Similarly, I mentioned before kind of this meditative experiences for me in creating things. Painting the branches was that way as well. And I don't know if you could imagine, I think some people could probably use the word tedious, right? Because you've got to get every little branch. But I never felt that way. It never felt like tedious for me to do it. It actually felt very much like an act of slowing down, and I enjoyed sort of feeling every surface with the paintbrush. And it reminded me of my charcoal drawing classes back from UCLA, when the professor would say, when you're looking at the subject, just make the charcoal in your hand synonymous with the surface that you're studying, that you're working on. And just think about, as you're drawing with your charcoal, almost like you're feeling it with the surface with your hand. And so when painting the branches, it reminded me of that. And then I sort of enjoyed that intersection with the actual charcoal drawings being in the same exhibition as well. As far as the branches experiencing a little bit of a restorative act, as this coat experienced a restorative act, my rule for the branches that I chose was to pick up things that, those that are already on the ground. So not to ever break one away from anything, just something that could just be found on the floor of the forest, and something that was dry and perhaps entering decay. So I don't know what would happen in the years, if I just left them where they were, but I'm assuming they would start to break down. Fungus would live in them, and some of the fungus is actually quite beautiful in the forests, and then probably some insects as well would play a part in the decay, and it would ultimately go back to the earth. So there's a little bit of an act of preserving or kind of extending their life by painting them and bringing them in here and having them tell a story, continuing to tell their story. So kind of back to the idea of monuments. It took a little bit of a digression, but I just wanted to give you kind of the overview of that past exhibition and how some of it connects to the work here today. So one of the pieces that Sam mentioned in her introduction, it's very hard to pronounce. I had to look it up, like there's the Icelandic thing on Google that will actually tell you what it is. So it's Visceral, and it's a crater in Iceland that erupted 2,500 years ago. And when we went there in person with my husband 10 years ago, standing at the precipice of the cauldron, it just really struck me how here I am looking at something that's very old, that's been here for a long time. It's experienced its own erosion, of course, so it's not unchanged. But it's lived through wars, pandemics. It's lived through all these occurrences in human history while it's doing its own thing within its own time frame of geologic time. And this really struck me, and this idea of nature standing witness to human events kind of occurred to me, and I began to play with it after that. So nature is witness to human history. And natural formations like this crater or mountains as monuments that sort of stand and watch, and then we go and we watch them. So kind of this relationship, this back and forth relationship between us and them. The volcanic rock seen on the ground there, and here as well, is 100,000 years old, just to put it in perspective, which we take for granted because this is rock that we just place in, we can purchase it at a gardening store, and it comes in different colors. It comes in the beautiful like terracotta red as well, and you just put it in your garden, but you don't think about the fact that this rock is so very old. And I think it's a part of the beauty, knowing that it's been around for so long. And here in particular, the drawing is hung against this brick wall of a building that's also historic, like this gorgeous building here. And this one is 100 years old, and I was thinking, this was before the pandemic actually hit. I was thinking about how beautiful it was to think about where we are in the here and now in relationship to this very old rock, in relationship to the cauldron that's, erupted 2,500 years ago, and then we've got this brick that's like a man-made rock, right? And how that's 100 years old, and there's just kind of these layers of time that were interesting for me to kind of peel back at. So if nature stands witness to human history, when we watch nature, it's like we're two mirrors looking into each other. And that appeals to me because it's like it creates something of the infinite, right? There's something else there. So visiting a site with an internal time memory, for example, places where you could see maybe petrified trees in particular, or just a forest, craters, or human-made, like a historic building, we get to have that experience of the two kind of mirrors, the finite within the infinite. And I just like to feel that my work is not precious, that people can interact with it, they can even walk on it. We had someone get inside of the Reclamation house during the opening, and I thought that was great, why not? Which reminds me, actually, when I got into doing contemporary art specifically, it was after a trip to the Tate in London, and there was a sculpture there by Carl Andre, and it was on the floor, and it was these metal tiles. And I read the wall signage, and the wall said that you're allowed to walk across them. And I thought, really? At the Tate? I can walk on this sculpture? I went to the security guard, and I said, is this correct? I mean, I read this on the wall. Could I walk on it? He seemed a little bit peeved. He was sort of like, don't recommend it, But I thought, also, he didn't say no. So I did. I walked on it, and I thought, okay, this is the art that I'm interested in. I'm interested in something that invites you into a relationship with it, and that doesn't sort of act like it's too precious, right, to be touched, or too precious to be like engaged with. So from that exhibition, I wanted to mention this piece because it has a direct relationship to the horizon line piece here. Essentially, it's the horizon line, but in the vertical. So what you see here is a 39-foot piece of paper, continuous paper, with a continuous charcoal line, just one line on it. And we hung it up all the way up in the turret of the castle building that I showed you guys. And it came all the way down, and we lit the turret because it's quite dark and there's lots of kind of stairwells and little nooks and crannies, and usually the viewer who would go to the gallery wouldn't necessarily appreciate it unless they really studied it. But so we lit it so you could see the old wood, and it actually kind of smells as well. So you get the smell and have the visual go with the smell. And then the piece of paper ends just above reflective plinth, and you can see some of the reflective surfaces used here, like outside within or in the rise piece. And here it kind of serves to reflect the line back up sort of at itself or into eternity. So like a finite line reflected back internally. So there's this sort of play of the finite within the infinite. And additionally, I like another way to invite the viewer into the work is for them to see their own reflection in it. So just as someone might be looking at the line or at the charcoal drawing here, you also see your own reflection, and you see the reflection of the drawing or the subject matter portrayed, and it creates this sort of overlap that's interesting to me in our relationship with the art. There's the turret from the outside. So I talked about how in the past I was looking at craters and mountains and volcanic terrain. I'm going to talk about why trees, where did this visual come from, and what is why do they have that specific look to them? So trees in this case were the things that were the monuments in nature, based on my experience of going to the Black Sand Basin and seeing the type of trees that were there. So the type of trees that were there, they were saturated by silica. Silica was something that was abundant in this volcanic area with geysers and very active, still very active geologically area. And it just really struck me that while I was experiencing time in a different way during the pandemic, because this was summer of 2020, while we were actually moving from Minnesota to New Hampshire, we drove 1.5 times across the country because we were camping, because we were, nobody knew what was happening, so we didn't even stay at hotels. So just our family, we were just out in nature for a month. We did see some family in Seattle as well, and they took us in, so that was lovely. But otherwise, we were out there. And so being just really aware of how different time felt for me, looking at these silica trees that were frozen in time, I was looking at them, they were looking at me, and there was another one, it reminded me of that sort of crater experience again, and this time in the form of trees. I'm gonna talk about also the color inspiration, because those trees were white, and I of course have that like really velvety blue and orange in the tree painting as well. So there's video of one specific pool in the Black Sand Basin, and it's called Sunset Lake. And I think it's probably obvious why, because it's got that beautiful kind of sunset-inspired color, very vivid blue and orange. And I'm gonna show you, this is a frame from the video, but I also wanted to show you, if you pull back, this is what the rest of it is. So while the video just loops with that very particular framing that I've got there, so it kind of seems like a drawing almost, with the perpetual ripples. It was a very windy area, just perpetual ripples running across the water, and this constant warm fog that sometimes as you walk by, it would envelop you and it would surprise you, because sometimes it would kind of come from behind and it felt like a warm hug. It was like, wow, nature's hugging me. And so that's what it actually looked like being there, a little bit more of a pulled away view from the video that's in this exhibition. Sorry, skipping around, okay. And there you see some of the trees that have been saturated by silica, and some of the terrain that has the silica and various other minerals and elements that are on the photo there on the left. And I just wanted to mention, this wasn't an area that you could actually step down and like with your boots or your shoes. They had very specific walking, kind of, what would you call it, pathways that they made out of wood, and it was dangerous if you like dropped a hat, say goodbye to the hat, like don't try to pick it up or something like that. So it wasn't, there's this idea of kind of danger in the environment. You don't want to drop your car keys in there, or you might be there for a while. And so there's a close-up of what kind of sludgy stuff it really was, like what it looked like. It was very white. And then on the left, you see one of the stumps that I mentioned. This one in particular is a combination of one I saw in New Hampshire in the forest, and also this one there at the Black Sand Basin. And it's not just the noon lighting that's very harsh in this photo. It really was quite white like that. And that's just me there. And I remember I tied my hat around myself because it was very windy. And I'm adding a sound piece to the video today. And I wanted to mention that there's wind sounds in that sound piece. And I worked with a musician that I worked with in the past for a previous exhibition called Traverse. I reached out to him again because naturally the video is just wind, and it's not necessarily pleasant for you guys to like have that. But what I did is I took the panels from Rise and I moved the panels because in installing them and playing with them in my studio, I realized that they make a very wind-like sound, almost like something what people would do for sets, you know, in Hollywood. So I sent him video of me kind of intermittently making those sounds, and he incorporated them, and he created a piece that has that and some of his other things that he mixed into it as well. So I'll be installing that either later tonight or next week, so that if you guys come back into the gallery, there'll be also that sound dimension. And the hat with the wind reminds me of just how windy it really was. Something else that struck me there, especially during the COVID pandemic, is just this idea of organisms not just surviving but thriving in difficult circumstances, and that as a theme also remains relevant in light of the invasion of Ukraine as well. And I remember reading about this spider that is thriving on the fact that there's bugs that come to this area, and so he's doing great. And then you can see on the left also there's a description and some more of those kinds of trees that don't have leaves, that don't have any needles on them, if any of them are pine trees. It's just a very kind of stark, you get this kind of, to me it's almost like the bones or the body, right, of the tree without everything else, the other adornments. Sorry, just a second. Okay, so back to these trees in particular. So for this exhibition, it was really this kind of merging of the trees that I saw there and the trees in New Hampshire. So next I'm going to talk about the Reclamation House. And Reclamation House also has a relationship, you know, I've been talking about these threads of past work, and then what you see here as well. I'm going to reference where the Reclamation House, what it used to be. So in November 2018 to January 2019, it was a water house. That exact same structure, we used the exact same pieces of wood. It was installed this way on the ground with water, and the viewers were invited to throw rocks into the water. You see a girl who came with her mom to check out the show, throwing a rock in there, and what you end up getting is you see all the various visitors who've come through there, and each rock sort of represents their time that they spent there. And this, just the way that it was, the space felt very kind of meditative. I left some places for people to sit there as well. I just wanted to, for people to feel like they could just stay there a while, or maybe sit with a friend. And the rocks that we see here in Reclamation House are, the smaller ones are from here, from literally the water house, the ones that people threw in. And some of the larger ones are from the installation of the visceral crater. And you guys are invited to take a rock with you. At the opening, we had a number of people take a rock with them, and it's up to you what you do with it. I've sort of began a scattering of the rocks in the choice of composition here, and I like the idea that when you take one, this scattering continues as it goes with you, so you become kind of part of the work that way. And also it creates a touch point with somebody you've never met and you've never actually shared time or space with, but it speaks to kind of some of the themes of community that are part of this exhibition. And I was thinking about this as I was writing it. Hypothetically, we are sharing time and space with each other just by living through this particular time in history. So even if it feels like we're separate, we do have this shared kind of experience as being part of humanity now, you know. There's some more kids. One of the things I enjoyed about this particular installation is sometimes I would find people leaving behind formations that they would create even on the ground as well. So in addition to throwing it in, they would just kind of play with the rocks. And it was just always sweet for me to find that someone's engaged and kind of felt welcome to like make it their own. Somebody else comes along, moves it yet again. And so there's kids, some other kids playing with the rocks as well. So this invitation for the viewer to change the work is something that I like to play with, and the other element that I like to invite to change the work or to take part in creating the work with me is nature itself. So the next example of work will relate to what happened to the structure of the house since it was the water house. And I'm going to discuss this piece called, it is preservation, erosion and preservation. So erosion and preservation, what you guys are looking at is an acrylic box. Inside of that box is a plaster book that I made, and inside of the plaster book are hand-transcribed pages from an Icelandic saga. I placed them into this vessel. The purpose of that was to fill it halfway with water and to just let water do the work. So you see here the water has already evaporated and it's sort of left these this stains on the book itself, and the minerals have released themselves from the water, and so there's this kind of natural erosion of the plaster book that's taking place. The book continues to stand and sort of tell its story, but part of the story is actually the way that it's weathering. So the piece itself becomes how it's changing over time. So as the something to mention about why I chose Icelandic pages for this particular one, the Icelandic sagas were taken away by the King of Denmark. And then many years later, I think it was actually like in the 90s, the Icelandic people received their written sagas back, the original documents. And it was a very sweet moment that I read about in their Reykjavik paper about people just standing on the dock waiting for these texts to arrive, waiting for a piece of their history to return to them. And so it made me think about the way that cultures fight to preserve their culture and their history and their memories, and then just sort of the elements that can erode away at that, and the two work together. So I wanted to show you what it looks like as of, because it keeps changing. So as of February 2022, it is no longer in the vessel. It no longer needs to be. The water is gone. I've taken it out, so it's continuing to oxidize and change and that's what it looked like in 2022. And it had particularly special meaning to me to share this in light of the invasion of Ukraine back in February. So now I'm going to talk about the frame here and what happened to it and why I showed you the previous piece. So the previous piece with the water, allowing the water to take part in creating the work, we pre-soaked these pieces, these wood pieces, in a salt solution, and as well as Epsom salt, and we waited for the water to evaporate, and then we took them out and let them dry. And that's why you can sort of see some of the Epsom salt kind of glittering on the surface. It's a part of, because I was thinking about, okay, well, it used to be the water house, and it was on the floor, and there's this action of people throwing rocks in. This time I'm inviting you guys to take rocks out, and what's happened to the water? I thought, well, the water's evaporated, right? So why don't we just kind of play with that, with the structure, and pre-soak it and let the water evaporate and kind of bathe over the surface, and then reinstall it in this more weightless kind of state. It's kind of suspended state. And the significance of the bottles, one with water, one with flour, in thinking about the Reclamation house, and when I proposed it to Ava, like a year and a half ago, I was thinking about what sustains us at a minimum. I think often about Maslow's pyramid of needs, how at the very top it's just food and water, the things you need for survival. And the very next thing after that is belonging. And belonging is about community, and belonging is understanding who I am, what's my value in community or in the world, right? So the water and the flour is what we need at a minimum, the sustaining, right, part. And the salt is maybe, preserving part. But then I was thinking as we would be entering, hopeful, this is hopeful thoughts, as we would be entering this time in 2022, that perhaps we'd be coming out of the pandemic, we'd be coming out of this time where we were just sustaining, and perhaps there'd be time to reclaim things, right? Reclaim something, call something back, or call something forth, or maybe it was simply a time to acknowledge a loss, and I think that's a part of it, because I think until you sort of acknowledge the loss, it's difficult to go forward and claim new things or claim old things that you realize are forever changed. So Reclamation House is that sort of meditative invitation for the viewer to come and, as they take a rock with them, to think about those elements. So next we have Rise, installed there by the windows, and I'm excited actually to come back and see it during daylight. I keep seeing it at night, but it's by the windows because it tends to, I just know from my studio space, it catches light in beautiful ways and reflects it kind of with these water-like patterns, and also throws some of the shadows of the line quality that's already there in place on the floor and other walls as well. And I just wanted to explain, you don't have to get this from it, and it's not a guessing game. It's perfectly fine if you're not getting it from the work when you look at it, but they are outlines of three figures. So they're, three figures. In my mind, it's one and the same, just one is laying down on the ground, the next one seemed to be rising slightly higher, and the next one really is like about to stand up, as kind of like the next posture, or it can actually read in either direction. It could read as a rising, or it could read as returning back to earth. And the branches underneath that I chose and painted, I wanted them to echo some of the line quality in the painting portion of the installation, and also to kind of have a little bit of that vein-like fractal presence to echo the connection of the human body to the natural world. With that, we are nature reminder. In the past, a similar installation, different scope, different colors, and it was saying something different, also utilized human figures. In this case, there was, I think, 7 of them stacked on top of each other, and 8 panels of them. They progressively moved from depictions of human form that were towards the back, and then towards the front, they would progress towards looking more like landscapes, mountains, and the very last panel was very water-like. So it was this continued abstraction of the human form morphing into landscape. And I sort of brought it back in a new way for a new reason into this gallery. Just a picture of installation evening there. So in creating the last 3 exhibitions, it's just becoming apparent to me that there's always going to be unknowns that we're living through in history, whether it's the pandemic or an invasion or a war. And I keep mentioning these awful things. Of course, there are cycles, and we cycle through times of prosperity as well. And I think it's healthy to just say, like, oh, yes, this will always be, but this is not the end of the story, right? And while there are these cycles, it's important to remember that we also come out of cycles, and we can reclaim things, and we can redefine things, or old things that seem to be decaying can find new life, just as, landscapes that find rest after coming out of geologically active times as well. So something like a crater, it finds rest into such a beautiful state that we get to go and look at it, but prior to that, it went through a cataclysmic event. So this idea of cataclysmic events finding rest and beauty is something that is kind of in the back of my mind for creating this body of work as well. So I have an actual route here in the gallery that I used a torch to charcoal it up. I'm using charcoal to draw the drawings. And this idea that when we look at a forest, it strikes me that what I see outside of my window in the studio in New Hampshire is a community of trees. But then I also think about what's unseen, and what's unseen below the surface are all of the roots that touch and intertwine in the way that the trees communicate with each other and support each other. I'm interested in that aspect as well, the kind of the unseen connections. And so to that end, I think about our connections to people in other parts of the world. So being from Ukraine, myself, just the fact that here we are in New Hampshire, in Lebanon, but there are these unspoken connections of people we've never seen or met, just as, it's kind of a reminder of that with having the touch point of picking up the rock, a rock that someone else threw in. You don't know their story, you've never met, but yet we kind of have that kind of unspoken, shared experience. So one thing that's actually, I think, really great that I wanted to mention is I've been following a number of different humanitarian relief efforts in Ukraine, and this one, because I have a house structure here, and so you can certainly think about domesticity and home life and life in it, like shelter, the idea of shelter, like through outside within as well. Just something that I wanted to put out and make available to you guys during this exhibition is this particular effort called Repair Together. And Repair Together invites the young people of Ukraine, the people who would normally be going to raves and dancing to electronica music, now in time of war, what they're doing is they're coming together, and there'll be a DJ and they'll play music, but they're actually shoveling, removing debris, and rebuilding as well. So not only clearing out buildings and cultural centers, I think that's been kind of how it began. They were really targeting cultural centers. And they're also putting out new bricks and rebuilding walls as well. So first the cleanup and then the rebuilding. And I've seen some really sweet photos where you see people from different generations also come to watch and just delight in seeing these young people who, I mean, maybe 2 years ago would have just been dancing and enjoying themselves, but here they are doing something for the community, and sometimes they put on like a little concert at the end for the people in community and stuff as well. So I've got 2 QR links for you guys. One is to just learn more information. There's a wonderful article by the Washington Post, and they've got video and an interview with the founder of this effort. And then the second link is if you wanted to support it. So I'll leave that up if you guys want to get more information. That's the way that you can do that. And I also have a page on my website that's dedicated to Ukraine. So if you go to my website and you just click on Ukraine, I try to update it, and I'll add this to that as well. So I'm just looking at the time. I don't know if there's time for a couple of question Q&A. Yes. Oh, yes. So I almost forgot. Thank you. Well, one more piece, definitely worth mentioning. And on the windowsill here, it can get missed. I asked my kids to create something where if they thought about a little squirrel squirreling away, or a little animal, kind of how they would hide things in a hollowed out tree, to gather up the kind of materials that they see in the exhibition, like branches and maybe tinsel, because sometimes birds get attracted to like the shiny things, and to create a little small installation of their own. And I wanted them to really think about kind of mimicking the animals in the forest. And the reason that I did that is because there's a parallel to my gathering of the sticks for the forest here. I realized that when I began collecting them in the fall of 2020, I didn't know why, I was but I realized that I was working alongside the animals in the forest. They were probably stashing away for the winter. I was stashing them in my studio, and knowing that I'm going to paint them later, I'll paint them in the winter months, And so I just became aware of this kind of, the parallels of how we were taking from nature, and then just kind of a part of our survival. Because, and the little piece that my girls created is echoing that as well. That kind of squirreling away. That's what it's called. Thanks. Yeah.
Have you ever had the opportunity to collaborate with theater or dance, just because your work is so interactive?
I would like to, it's crossed my mind to actually work with dancers a number of times. I feel like I'm very close to that. Yeah. I think I have a couple of dance instructors in mind who I think it would be a good collaboration in the future. I've worked with a musician, and we worked together to make, his name is Chris Kostelek, and we made some of the sculptures that I made out of plaster in the past. We made them interactive, where a person could take a rock that we put conductive paint on, and we had these kind of like wire filaments sticking out, so they could actually move the rock around, and it changed the sound that was coming out. So that was really fun. That was a great collaboration to do. Theater would be interesting too, because I have a background in scenic design, just the college preparatory school that I worked at in Santa Monica, California, being the art teacher there. I also created all the sets. And so actually I think a part of me not shying away from doing large-scale work is because I've done large-scale work in a matter of like a week during like tech week, like hardly sleeping. And I just remember being tasked with like, we need this mountain. It's going to be 54 feet up in the air. I was like, okay, a mountain 54 feet up in the air. So then it feels like not that big of a deal to make a drawing that's 12 feet.
Being from California, which is a very different type of environment than Minnesota is in here, have you ever done work that comes out of your knowledge of the Californian environment, which is so different?
Yeah, it is quite different. And my work was different then too, but actually some of the ideas that thread through my more recent bodies of work did begin there. I don't have any of those examples. I do have them on my website. One piece in particular had to do with communication, and it was extracts from a poem with the literature teacher that I used to work with at my school, who was a wonderful writer and a poet. And so I had embroidered those onto these cellophane sheets, and the cellophane sheets then ended in these puddles that were filled with water. It was actual water. And those were a part of the KCRW Summer Nights in Chinatown, in one of the Chinatown galleries. Did a series of 3 installations then. And I'm trying to think I can't say that work was specifically very LA. I think it just kind of was about meditation. It would be kind of meditative and connection to other people and communication, kind of how do you know something to be true, or how do we, I think it's about community in a way as well. Thank you. Any other questions? Or observations?
No, just thank you for doing all your work. I moved here last year, and I'm from Ukraine, and I would never know Katya unless my friend would invite me. And I was so happy that somebody cares, not only like about your work, but also about like where you're from and you presenting, and you'll never forget Ukraine support. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I like the way you see things. For example, when you talk about things unseen, and you mention those things, you mention also about the branch decaying the life, but the different purpose that comes in different seasons. How it was used as a tree now, it can be shelter, it can be so many other things. You have such a different perspective of things. I just love sitting here listening.
Oh,
So
thanks.
thank you for putting this work together. It's just such a pleasure being here.
Well, thank you. And you guys make the work come to life, as I say. Otherwise, it's an insular experience of just being in your studio, and it's part of the cycle of the work as well. It's important, certainly, but I appreciate you guys being here and engaging with the work and having your thoughts and questions, and feel free to stay and share more. Shall we wrap it up? Anything else?
Do you have any projects lined up for the future?
I don't actually at the moment. I do have some installations that exist in my mind, and I'm considering some spaces around New Hampshire, but we'll see where they land. Yeah. Thank you.